Hey guys, so we're going to be talking about love, lust, attraction, gender differences a lot as we progress through the semester. So I wanted to post a video to kind of simulate a lecture in the classroom for it. Now, there's a lot of material already up there for you guys, and I want to make sure you guys take a look at that. The video from Ellen Fisher and the article, and do some research on your own as well. It's a really interesting subject, and like it says in the syllabus, make sure you're reading through the midterm paper in the syllabus, but I think it's in a subject that really hits home for everyone to some degree, so that's why I like to focus on this a little bit. So I want to post a video just talking a little bit about some things as it relates to love attraction. I'm not going to go into as much detail as I would in a classroom lecture because I want to keep this a little shorter for you guys, so that you guys can focus on it. But that doesn't mean that if you have more questions you can't email me or Skype me. Again, both resources I want you guys to take advantage of. If you have some more questions, if you want to talk a little bit more, I spent my career researching pretty much this. This has been a big focus on my research in my career. So I love talking about it. If you have questions, make sure you contact me. But as we start talking about it, the very first thing I want you to do is take a second. I want you to think about what the three most powerful emotions are. Whether they're good or bad, positive or negative, what are the three most powerful emotions that exist? If you need a second, pause the video to think of those. Was love one of the three that you came up with? Was happiness one of the three? Those usually are pretty universal, and they're interchangeable which one comes number one or number two, but they tend to be number one and number two. The third one, it can change. It's most commonly sadness, second most commonly it's anger, but it could be anything from there. Well, why I'm asking you to do that is to see how important love tends to be to everyone. It tends to be number one and number two on this list, but there's a major problem with that. A major problem when it came to the research. It's that the research doesn't support love as being what's called a primary emotion. Sure, it fits the definition for a secondary emotion, but I don't have to go any further than that with you guys to just take a second, stop and think about it. That sucks. Thinking about love, that it's not a primary emotion, it's a secondary emotion, we don't need any more detail to know that that almost by definition means it's less important than a primary emotion. Well, that kind of sucks, and that was a major hiccup as it went for the research on love for a long time. There wasn't much advancement in this research because, well, we can look at it as a secondary emotion, but to say it's a secondary emotion when we know how important people view it as, that it's usually number one or number two on their list, it stinks. So then, as time progresses, along comes Helen Fisher, and she says, well, maybe love isn't an emotion at all. Maybe it's motivational drive. And to give you, just to rewind for 1 second, to give you an idea of what a primary emotion is, if I asked you to show me happiness on your face, could you do that? Sadness, could you do that? Shock, anger. In primary emotions we can show on our face. Not only can you show it, but I could look at you showing that face, and I'd be able to say, that's happiness, that's sadness. Everyone has that universal type of face for happiness or shock and surprise, etc., etc. If I asked you to show me love on your face, could you do that? Some of you might be nodding your head yes and might be saying, yeah, I have a face for love. Sure, okay, that'd be fine. But here's the thing. Could I look at that face and say that's love, like I would if you did a face for happiness? Well, for some of you I might say it's love. For others I might say it's happiness. For some of you I might say it's constipation. Because the point being is there just isn't a universal look for love. Now, Helen Fisher comes along and she uses what's called an fMRI scan. She puts people into this functional MRI and sees what area of the brain's being lit up. And what she finds is it's not the area for emotion that's being lit up. Now, it's very close. It's just beneath the area of emotion in what's called VTA cells. I'm not going to go into detail about that. That's what that video from Helen Fisher and that article goes into detail about. But she says maybe love isn't an emotion at all. Maybe it's a motivational drive. So think of it like hunger. Hunger is a motivational drive. What happens when you don't eat? You get hungrier and hungrier. It starts to progressively, it'll start to consume you. It'll be all you think about. It's kind of cool to then think of love that it kind of works that way. It speaks to how important it is that it's a need now. And that's really the key difference. It's a need. We need to have it. We need to eat. Hunger is a need. It's not a want. It's a need. So that can be kind of cool to think of it that way. And that'll really set the tone for a lot of the research that we're going to be using and a lot of the different things that we're going to be going into. Make sure you're reading through the syllabus for this assignment. and taking a look at exactly what we're going to be talking about, what we're going to be using, and all the choices that you guys have with it. So beyond that, I just want to touch for maybe 5 more minutes, maybe 10 more minutes, on a couple of other really cool things that I find interesting here. And if you guys have some more questions, if you want to do that, you can use these things for your assignment. So the very first thing I want to touch on is almost a little bit of the aside from some of the other things, and that's, what's the opposite of love? So a lot of you are probably thinking hate right now. But let's simplify that. What is love? Love is, for better or worse, for whatever definition you have, love is going to be feeling very, very strongly in a positive fashion for someone. Beyond that, everyone's going to have a different definition, so we can't really go much further than that. So is the opposite of feeling very, very strongly in a positive fashion going to be hate, which is basically feeling very, very strongly in a negative fashion for someone? Remember, you have to care a lot about a person to hate the person. You have to have a big investment to hate a person. Not really. The opposite of love and the opposite of hate are actually going to be the same thing. They're going to be indifference. The opposite of feeling very strongly in a positive fashion is going to be feeling nothing at all. Just like hate, feeling very strongly in a negative fashion is going to be feeling nothing at all. The point and the reason I bring this up is that love and hate are actually probably closer to synonyms than they are to antonyms. Meaning, they relate to each other. It's sensible and it makes perfect sense, and it's easy to see how someone can go from loving someone to hating someone that easily, because they're closer to synonyms than they are to opposites. So that's, I think, sets the tone a little bit as well. But the things I want to talk to you guys about really quickly with this video are going to be how these processes work when it comes to attraction, when it comes to love, when it comes to even lust. Now, there's going to be a couple chemicals that are going to play a major role in this and in these processes. The first one being vasopressin, which really it's going to play a big role in lust, and it gets into a little bit basically describing the sex drive. It relates to testosterone, and then we have the opposite of that, well, not the complete opposite, but the other extreme, which is oxytocin. Oxytocin is a chemical you guys might have seen, it's been around, I've seen it on memes and things like that. They've talked about it on The Big Bang Theory and things like that. It's simplified to the cuddle hormone, and that's how you might have seen it. You might have actually seen an article about the cuddle hormone. That's oxytocin. Oxytocin is going to relate to attachment, which attachment is important because attachment is basically what we're going to use to describe deep romantic love. It's not a universal thing, love. So what we do is we like to simplify it to attachment, where it's this deep feeling of, very literally, I don't know what I would do if that person wasn't here. I don't know how I would live my life without that person. I don't know how to continue without them. That's a very deep and very real feeling. The other process is going to be a little bit more about dopamine, the attraction process. So what this is, and actually I'm going to, hopefully this will show up on you guys. Let me draw this as I talk to you guys about it. Is I want to show you a little graph about how these things are going to interact and how these things are going to look. So what's going to happen is, and just stop for a second and think, could you imagine if you had just started a relationship with a person and within a couple dates you were deeply attached to the person to the point where you don't know what you would do without that person in your life? You wouldn't be able to continue living your life without that person in it. Well, if you're anything like me, that would terrify you. I would turn and start running. I'd be in Colorado by the end of the day if that happened that quickly. It would be terrifying. And that's really what happens and what is a big point of these processes. So hopefully we can get this to see. So this graphic that's right here, you can see these lines. The first one that's, let me see if I can point to it. The first one right here is the lust drive. Now that's kind of independent. That's going to be more about your sex drive. That's vasopressin related, and it's going to just shoot straight up. This second line, the one that goes up and then starts to tail off, that you can see all the way down here, now that's going to be about attraction and oxytocin. That's the label that I wrote on it. Now, what happens when you start a relationship? Think about the feelings you have right off the bat in a relationship. And actually, that's a good thing that you guys can do if you want something fun to do, is make a list of 10, 15 of them, something like that. Think about the things that happen when you first start a relationship. giving you some examples, maybe butterflies in the pit of your stomach, where you can't eat, you can't sleep, they're always on your mind, you always want to be near them. Well, taking a second to think about it, do those last for forever? No. You can go pretty crazy if they lasted forever. Eventually they start to fade. Eventually we get from that point where you're always on my mind, I can't eat, I can't sleep, I can't go about my day because I'm always thinking about you, I always want to be near you, eventually changes to, for the love of God, give me a day to myself, right? That's what this process is about. At the same time that that's happening, as this starts to go up and we have all those warm fuzzy feelings, the butterflies at the start, that's when this last line, this vasopressin or attachment line, like right here, I should have used different colors or something for you. That progressively is going to more or less steadily, not perfectly steadily, obviously there's ups and downs in a relationship, go up. And what happens is that second line, the one that starts to fade, that starts to go down, that oxytocin and attraction line, it basically works as a shield. It's shielding you from the feelings of vasopressin, of attachment, of that I can't live without the person. So that by the time we get to this point where those two lines crisscross, one more time, where those two lines are going to crisscross somewhere around here, well, at that point, that's when vasopressin becomes the dominant chemical in your relationship, and you get to the point where you're deeply attached to that person. But by that point that it crisscrosses, well, it's actually an acceptable, and it's a warm, it's a good feeling. It doesn't scare us potentially anymore. It might still scare us, and that's why when we get to that point in time, a lot of us are going to end relationships. A lot of us it might not be high enough that it's a welcome feeling, and it might still be scary, so we might end a relationship because we didn't have a high enough feeling of love. Some of us, it will be high enough, and we're going to stay in it and be happy, and it's going to be a welcomed feeling. It doesn't happen right away. That's what the role that that dopamine plays. And thinking about it, I totally labeled this wrong. So apologies to you guys. I labeled these chemicals wrong, so I'm going to fix it really quick for you guys. This is what happens when I wrote this up while I was talking to you. So, vasopressin, and this one is attachment and oxytocin, and this last one is attraction and dopamine. So one more time, I'm sorry guys, I actually wrote that wrong, so you guys can hopefully see this a little bit. That first line right here, that's going to be lust and vasopressin. The one that goes up and then fades down, that goes all the way down here, is going to be the attraction line with dopamine. The last one right here is going to be oxytocin and attachment. So now that I can put that down and actually simplify it with you guys, dopamine, that's what that is. Butterflies in the pit of our stomach is basically a literal interpretation of feeling a really big rush of dopamine. Can't eat, you can't sleep, you're always thinking about them, you're focusing attention, you're trying to figure them out. Those are all symptoms of dopamine being high. As the relationship goes up, dopamine goes from really, really high to it starts to progressively fade. It's not going to get to zero, but it's going to go down because we would go crazy if it was always that high. Same time that goes down, that's when oxytocin is going up progressively. Oxytocin is going up at a slow rate, and eventually they're going to crisscross. So now the dopamine that's acting as a shield for this, because otherwise it would scare us and would terrify us, eventually now it crosses, and now at that point dopamine is lower than oxytocin. Oxytocin is the dominant factor in our relationship. We are then potentially in love with that person. If we're not, we probably would end the relationship. That's why a lot of relationships end at around the 1 to 2 year mark when this starts to really crisscross, depending on the person. On average, it's probably 12 to 18 months that'll crisscross, but it could be anywhere from even 6 months, and you can have it happen a lot quicker depending on the individual level to probably 3 years on the top end. Most of the time it's going to be within that 12 to 24 months though. And at that point in time, we're going to naturally reevaluate it because now they're starting to fade. They're not going to get to zero, but they can. They can go very low. They're not going to get to zero except for in very extreme cases. That's not going to usually happen. But they will fade. That's the point of this. So as we look at that, and that's when I said to make that list of the feelings when you first start a relationship, most of those things that you're going to write on that list, if you wrote down, let's say you wrote down 10, 15 things, I'd say 80%, 90% of them are going to directly relate to dopamine. Now if you took a second though, and you wrote down another list of the symptoms that you feel when you get dumped. You're going to have different things on that list, but you're going to find the same thing. Probably about 80 or 90% of them are going to relate to dopamine. Why does this happen? Well, basically it happens because we're biologically programmed to fight for those that we love. We know deep down, and I'm sure you guys all can agree and all can relate to this, is that we know, yes, there are a lot of fish in the sea, but there are not a lot of good fish. So if we were in a relationship with a person, presumably for at least some point in time, we thought they were a good fish. So what happens is we're biologically basically programmed to fight for that person, to think about all those feelings we had when we started that relationship. Is it cruel? Yeah, it's cruel when you think about it. But when you're dumped, you basically will love them harder, at least for a short period of time. That will fade, but you're going to think about all those more fun when it was successful, when this was a successful relationship, when this person was a proverbial good fish. And you might reevaluate. That's why a lot of people do re-enter relationships that end it, because you might reevaluate and say, no, this person is a good fish, this person is for me. Is it possible that they're not? Yeah, absolutely, and in which case you're not going to re-enter the relationship, and eventually that will fade. But in the meantime, that's what happens when we're dumped. And when we do the dumping, the major thing with that is they don't happen at the same time. Presumably the person that does the dumping will go through these feelings and go through these thoughts, but they'll go through it before they actually pull the trigger and end the relationship. The person that gets dumped, this happens after, obviously. So what happens is we don't have this happen at the same time. If it did happen at the same time, we probably almost always go back to each other. But because they don't happen at the same time, well, that's when we can potentially see, if it is good or if it is not good. And that's how we obviously end relationships that aren't successful. The very last thing that I want to talk to you guys about, and one thing I'd also add is, those are Helen Fisher in that article, great things with this process. Arthur Aaron is a really good thing. If you watch The Big Bang Theory, they actually just recently had something about one of our Aaron's experiments with oxytocin that you can ask these, I think it's a list of 20 questions, 40 questions, whatever it is, and you can basically fall in love with the person, combined with just looking into their eyes for, I forget if it's 5 minutes or something like that. Well, staring into the person's eyes will increase your oxytocin level. That is absolutely true. Those questions are basically designed to reveal a little bit more intimate and personal details that progressively will make you care about a person a little bit more. So that's the logic to that test. Sorry about that, that was my dog. So there's definitely logic to that test and how that would work. Now, beyond that, there's one thing that popped in my head. I'll have to come back to it if it comes back to me, otherwise maybe I'll post another video about it. So, beyond that, we have what's successful love, what's not. Sternberg's theory, Robert Sternberg, and you can look that up on your own, is we have different types of love. And all three of them would equal consummate love. We don't all need to have consummate love. It might be ideal, probably for most of us it's ideal, but some of us, we might not want a certain type of love. For example, we might not need commitment to mean that we have love. We might still believe that we're in love without having commitment or passion. There's plenty of people who are elements of successful relationship where they're deeply happy that they don't really have passion. They don't have a sexual attraction to one another, and they're still very happy and very literally could not live without the other person, to the point where if that person was removed, they could have physiological harm, even death. There's definitely examples that a person can lose suddenly a person that they love very deeply, and then all of a sudden they're overcome with some new illness that they didn't have before, because they physiologically have some symptom of this loss of love, because they cared that deeply. And that goes to speak on how amazing love is as well, and how special love can be, and the magic to love, basically. The last thing that I want to talk to you guys about, let's see, I talked to you guys about that, so yeah, I guess the only other thing that I really want to focus on with you guys is, well, what's the point of, I'll even say what's the point of sex, but what's the point of a relationship, and that's procreation. Well, that's a big factor in this, is the biology of this. We are designed to pair bond with our mating partner. We are designed to raise a child together. Not every species in the animal kingdom does this, but we are one that is. So much of the biology of what happens and goes on with us is designed to attach us to the person that we're with so that we can raise a child with them together. So much of what happens in all of these processes as oxytocin goes along is that we become attached to the person that we are with. Oxytocin is released in space just through orgasm and through intercourse. Oxytocin is released from staring into the person's eyes, from holding the person, from hugging the person, from just being near the person can raise our oxytocin levels. We're supposed to get more attached to that person because we might raise a child together, and we're supposed to raise that child together. As it comes to raising a child, I mean, that's the example to finish with this, to really show you how strong oxytocin is. A woman could be planning on giving up her child for adoption, then give birth to the child, and now she no longer can. I'm sure you guys have heard of that or seen that on, a TV show or something like that before. It's something that does happen. Why is it happening? It's because the act of childbirth releases such an unbelievable amount of oxytocin that a mother is actually immediately attached to her child just from the act of giving birth to that child. So it can be really hard to then give up that child because you now became attached to that child. Oxytocin is a very special chemical, and it really, really speaks a lot to what love is and how we look at love. Now, there's plenty of other things that we can talk about. I'm going to put a much shorter video that's going to go through some of those things that are in your assignment that we can go into, but we can also, if you have questions, just let me know, because we can talk more and more about any more of these different systems, whether we're looking at the more detail about the lust versus attraction versus attachment system, or the chemicals, vasopressin versus dopamine versus oxytocin, whether we're looking at just what love is and things like that. There's so much more interesting stuff to that. So if you are, make sure if you're interested in any of these, make sure you send me emails, send me a Skype message, and we can talk more about it. But otherwise, start doing some research on your own and getting ready for what is interesting to you, figuring out what's interesting to you on what you're going to want to talk about. And make sure you watch that video for Helen Fisher. It definitely is an important video as well. And the article is right about that video as well. It supports the video. Actually, in the video, she mentions the article that was widely publicized. That's that article that I posted for you guys. Alright, if you have questions, send me emails. Alright?